Story 1. The Echo Hiker. Nathan Cross was a 43-year-old audio engineer from Nashville who had spent 20 years working with sound, recording, mixing, and mastering music in professional studios. He understood acoustics, understood how sound waves behaved in different environments, understood the physics of echoes and reverberations. In August 2019, while solo hiking through the dense forests of Southern Virginia, Nathan discovered that some echoes don't bounce off physical surfaces. They reflect off temporal ones, and that hearing your own voice coming from the wrong direction in time can reveal futures you were never meant to know. Nathan was attempting a 7-day section hike, carrying high-quality portable recording equipment because he planned to capture ambient forest sounds for a nature documentary project. He had professional-grade microphones, digital recorders, and monitoring headphones that could pick up frequencies and details the human ear normally missed. The first 3 days, Nathan recorded extensively: bird calls, wind through leaves, streams flowing over rocks, the crunch of his boots on the trail. Each evening, he would review his recordings through his studio-quality headphones, cataloging interesting sounds for later use. On the 4th day, while recording in a narrow valley with steep sides, Nathan noticed something unusual in his headphone playback. Beneath the ambient forest sounds, there was a voice. His voice, speaking words he hadn't said. At first, Nathan assumed he had accidentally recorded himself earlier and forgotten about it. But as he listened more carefully, the words didn't match anything he remembered saying. The voice, definitely his own voice, he knew it intimately from years of recording, was saying, "I shouldn't have ignored the warning. The trail marker was clear. Now I'm completely lost and it's getting dark." Nathan stopped walking and played the recording again. The voice was there, faint but distinct underneath the nature sounds, speaking those exact words. But Nathan hadn't spoken those words. He wasn't lost, it wasn't getting dark, and he hadn't seen any warning markers. His audio engineering training kicked in. He analyzed the waveform, examining the frequency signature. The voice was definitely present in the recording, not an artifact or interference. It had the exact acoustic properties of his voice, but it was temporally displaced, recorded before he had spoken the words. Nathan decided to test this. He set up his equipment and began recording, then remained completely silent for 5 minutes. When he played back the recording, he heard his voice saying, "The pain in my ankle is getting worse. I don't think I can walk much further. I need to find shelter soon." Nathan's ankle felt fine. He had no pain, no injury. But he had just recorded himself, or a future version of himself, describing an ankle injury that hadn't happened yet. Over the next hour, Nathan recorded repeatedly, and each recording contained his voice describing future events. The timeline varied. Some recordings seemed to be minutes ahead, others hours, some possibly days. All of them described progressively worsening situations. Getting lost, injured, running out of food, experiencing severe weather. The recordings were prophecies, warnings from his future self, somehow bleeding backward through time and being captured by his equipment. Nathan's professional understanding of audio gave him no framework for this. Sound didn't travel backward through time. Echoes reflected off physical surfaces in the present, not temporal surfaces in the future. Nathan made a decision. He would leave the trail immediately, hike out to the nearest road, and avoid whatever future his recordings were describing. But as he turned to backtrack, he tripped over an exposed root, something he had easily stepped over hundreds of times in his hiking experience, and fell hard. Pain shot through his ankle, sharp, intense pain that made him gasp. He had just fulfilled the prophecy he had recorded. The injury his future self had described was now his present reality. Nathan sat on the trail examining his ankle. It was already swelling, possibly sprained. Definitely not something he could hike on comfortably. He pulled out his recordings and listened again. And now there were new elements he hadn't noticed before. Background sounds that matched his current location. The specific quality of late afternoon light affecting the acoustic environment. The recordings weren't from possible futures. They were from this future, the one he was now living. He had recorded echoes of himself from hours ahead, and those echoes were guiding him toward the exact timeline they described. Nathan tried to break the pattern. He set up his equipment and recorded, hearing his future self describe camping at a specific location. Nathan decided he would absolutely not camp at that location. He would hike past it or stop earlier, anything to prove the recordings weren't deterministic. But as he hiked on his injured ankle, the pain increased exactly as his recorded voice had described. By evening, he couldn't continue past the exact spot his future self had mentioned. He was forced to camp there, fulfilling another prophecy. Each recording created a self-fulfilling loop. By hearing his future voice describe events, Nathan became aware of them, and his awareness somehow locked him into that timeline. He was trapped in a causal loop where his recordings caused the very future they described. That night, Nathan recorded continuously, trying to hear further ahead, trying to understand how this resolved. The recordings were disturbing. His future voice described increasing desperation, ankle injury worsening, supplies running low. Days blurred together in the recordings. He heard himself at what seemed to be day 5, day 6, day 7, each time sounding more desperate. Then on what his future voice indicated was day 8, the recordings changed. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. I understand now. The recordings aren't warnings, they're not prophecies. They're echoes, but not bouncing off space, bouncing off time. Every moment creates echoes forward and backward. I've been hearing my future echoes, and by hearing them, I'm creating them. The only way to break the loop is to stop listening. Nathan made a decision that contradicted everything his professional training valued. He destroyed his recording equipment, smashed the digital recorders, broke the microphones, rendered all of it useless. Without the ability to record and playback, he couldn't hear the future echoes, couldn't lock himself into their timeline. The moment he destroyed the last piece of equipment, Nathan felt a shift, subtle but definite, like a pressure releasing. His ankle, which had been throbbing with pain, suddenly felt better. Not healed, but manageable. The swelling seemed less severe. Nathan hiked out over the next 2 days, moving slowly on his injured ankle but making steady progress. He reached a road and hitched a ride to the nearest town. His ankle was sprained, but not severely. It healed completely within a few weeks. But Nathan never worked as an audio engineer again. He couldn't. Every time he put on headphones in a studio, he heard echoes that shouldn't be there. Voices from the future, sounds that hadn't happened yet, temporal reflections bouncing backward through time into his recordings. He sold his studio and moved to a small apartment with no recording equipment. He works now in a coffee shop surrounded by constant noise that makes it impossible to hear individual echoes, protecting himself through auditory chaos from the dangerous clarity of professional-grade sound isolation. Nathan has warned other audio engineers and field recordists about temporal echoes, but his warnings are dismissed as breakdown from overwork or elaborate fiction. The audio engineering community has no framework for sound that travels backward through time, for echoes that reflect off future events rather than present surfaces. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, Nathan hears his own voice whispering from somewhere ahead in time, describing events that haven't happened yet, warning him about futures he might live if he listens too carefully. He has learned to ignore these echoes, to let them pass unheard and unrecorded, understanding that some sounds are meant to travel forward into silence rather than backward into awareness, that certain echoes become real only when we listen to them, and that the future is written in sound waves that most people are fortunate enough never to hear. Story 2. The cairn builders. Margaret Sullivan was a 50-year-old sculptor from Vermont who worked primarily in stone, creating cairns and rock sculptures in natural settings. She understood balance, understood how stones could be stacked in seemingly impossible configurations, understood the patience required to work with natural materials. In October 2017, while hiking through New Hampshire, Margaret encountered cairns that defied both physical laws and artistic intention. Structures that built themselves, adding stones from sources that couldn't be identified, growing taller each day without human intervention, and somehow incorporating pieces of the hikers who stopped to admire them. Margaret was on a solo artistic retreat, planning to photograph interesting rock formations and cairns along the trail for inspiration. She carried a high-quality camera and kept detailed notes about the structures she found, documenting their construction methods and artistic qualities. On the second day, Margaret found a cairn beside the trail that immediately captured her professional attention. It was unusually tall, perhaps 7 feet, and balanced with incredible precision. Stones of varying sizes were stacked in a configuration that seemed to defy gravity, leaning at angles that shouldn't be stable. Margaret photographed the cairn from multiple angles, impressed by whoever had built it. The construction showed sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and balance points. She estimated it must have taken hours to create. She added a stone to the top, a tradition among hikers when encountering cairns. It was a small, flat stone she found nearby, and she placed it carefully to maintain the structure's balance. Then she continued hiking, planning to return to photograph the cairn in different lighting conditions. The next morning, Margaret hiked back to the cairn, intending to photograph it in early light. But the structure had changed. It was taller, at least a foot taller, with several new stones added above where she had placed hers. The additions were balanced with the same impressive precision as the original structure. Margaret was puzzled. She had been one of the last hikers on this trail section yesterday evening, and she'd been the first this morning. Who had added stones during the night? Why would someone hike in darkness just to add to a cairn? She photographed the modified structure, documenting the changes. Then, curious about who the nighttime builder might be, Margaret decided to stake out the cairn. She set up her small tent about 50 yards off the trail, positioning herself where she could observe the cairn without being obvious. As evening fell, Margaret watched through the fading light. No hikers passed. The trail was silent and empty. But around midnight, by the light of her headlamp pointed toward the cairn, Margaret saw movement. Stones were moving, not falling or being placed by hands, moving on their own, crawling across the ground toward the cairn like slow insects. As each stone reached the base of the structure, it began climbing upward, finding purchase on other stones, pulling itself higher through some means Margaret couldn't comprehend. She watched, transfixed and terrified, as 3 stones made this impossible journey, adding themselves to the cairn's top, each one finding perfect balance despite the lack of any visible builder. Margaret's sculptor's mind struggled to process this. Stones didn't move on their own. They didn't crawl or climb. They were inanimate objects governed by gravity and inertia. Yet she was watching them behave like living things, purposefully adding themselves to a structure that apparently built itself. As dawn approached, the stone movement stopped. The cairn stood silent and still, now approximately 8.5 feet tall, looking completely normal except for its impossible construction process. Margaret broke camp and approached the cairn, examining it closely in daylight. The stones showed no signs of adhesive or hidden support. They were simply stacked, balanced through physics that should work but somehow achieved stability that exceeded what those physics should allow. She noticed something else, scratches on several stones near the base, marks that looked almost like words or letters but in no alphabet Margaret recognized. She photographed these marks, zooming in to capture details. Then Margaret made a mistake born of artistic curiosity. She tried to remove one of the stones from the lower part of the cairn, wanting to examine the markings more closely. The moment she pulled the stone free, the entire structure shuddered. The stones at the top began moving again, but this time with clear purpose and direction. They oriented toward Margaret, balancing on edges that shouldn't support their weight, leaning out from the cairn as if reaching for her. Margaret dropped the stone she had removed and backed away quickly. The cairn settled back into stillness, but she could feel a tension from it, an awareness that hadn't been present before. The structure knew she had taken something. She retreated to the trail and continued hiking, unnerved but rationalizing what she had seen as some geological phenomenon she didn't understand. Perhaps magnetic minerals creating movement, or thermal expansion causing shifts that appeared purposeful. But that evening, when Margaret set up camp 5 miles from the cairn, she found stones in her backpack. Not stones she had collected. These were from the cairn. She recognized their specific shapes and markings. They had somehow traveled 5 miles and gotten into her sealed pack without her knowledge. Margaret removed the stones and threw them into the forest, away from her campsite. But in the morning they were back, arranged in a small cairn beside her tent. More had joined them overnight. Her camp was surrounded by dozens of small cairns, each about a foot high, all oriented toward her tent like sentinels. She hiked quickly that day, trying to put distance between herself and whatever was happening. But stones continued appearing in her pack. Every time she removed them, more appeared. They were following her, accumulating, building themselves into structures in her presence. By the 3rd night after touching the original cairn, Margaret's tent was surrounded by hundreds of small stone structures. They formed rings around her campsite, each one precisely balanced, each one oriented toward her. And in the darkness, she could hear them, a sound like grinding stone, like rocks rubbing together. A slow, rhythmic sound that might have been breathing if stones could breathe. Margaret tried to smash the cairns, kicking them over, scattering their stones. But by morning they were rebuilt, taller than before, and the stones in her backpack had multiplied. Her pack was noticeably heavier, filled with rocks she hadn't collected, weighing her down. She dumped her entire pack, removing everything except essential survival gear, leaving behind the stones and most of her supplies. She hiked rapidly toward the nearest road, covering 20 miles in a single day despite her reduced supplies. But the stones followed. Each time she stopped to rest, small cairns would form nearby, stones rolling from the forest, assembling themselves, creating structures that watched her with eyeless attention. Margaret reached a road and flagged down a car. The driver, an older man, stopped to help. But when he approached Margaret, he recoiled. "What are those?" he asked, pointing. Margaret looked down at herself and screamed. Stones were embedded in her skin, small pebbles protruding from her arms and legs, having somehow grown into or through her flesh. They weren't painful, but they were there, part of her now, small stone cairns building themselves from her body. The man drove her to the nearest hospital. Doctors examined her in bewilderment. X-rays showed the stones were superficially embedded, not deep, but they couldn't be removed. Every time doctors extracted one, another would appear nearby. The stones were using Margaret as material, incorporating her into their endless construction. Medical science had no explanation. The stones appeared to be growing from her skin, emerging from her pores, crystallizing from her body's minerals through some process that shouldn't be possible. Margaret was becoming a cairn, a structure building itself from human material. Over the following months, more stones emerged. They grew primarily on her arms and torso, small pebbles pushing through skin, arranging themselves in balanced configurations. Margaret looked increasingly like a living stone sculpture, her body a medium for the cairn's endless construction. She stopped working as a sculptor. She couldn't touch stone anymore without feeling it respond, without sensing its desire to move, to stack, to build. Every rock she encountered wanted to join the structure that was consuming her, wanted to add itself to the cairn she was becoming. Margaret lives now in a small house far from the Appalachian Trail, far from mountains and stone, but her body continues its transformation. The stones grow slowly, adding themselves to the structure that was once human. She has documented the process photographically, creating a record of her transformation from sculptor to sculpture, from artist who worked in stone to stone that works on itself. She has tried to warn other hikers about cairns on the trail, about the danger of removing stones from structures that may be more than human-built. But her warnings are dismissed as the delusions of someone suffering from a mysterious medical condition. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret hears them, all the cairns she ever built during her artistic career, all the stone structures she carefully balanced and photographed. She hears them calling across distances, communicating in grinding stone languages, sharing information about the human who understood balance and stone stacking, the human who made herself known to them by building their structures, the human who became part of their endless construction, transformed from builder to building, from sculptor to sculpture, from flesh that arranged stones to stone that arranges itself, growing taller each day in configurations that defy gravity and intention, balanced impossibly, reaching towards something that only cairns understand. Story 3. The Thirst. Dr. James Whitmore was a 39-year-old nephrologist from Houston who specialized in kidney function and fluid balance. He understood hydration at a cellular level, understood how the human body processed and utilized water, understood the dangers of dehydration and the critical importance of maintaining proper fluid intake during physical exertion. In July 2016, while section hiking through Tennessee during an unusually hot summer, James discovered that thirst isn't always physiological. Sometimes it's metaphysical, and that certain needs, once awakened, can never be satisfied no matter how much water you drink. James was well prepared for hot weather hiking. He carried 3 liters of water capacity, electrolyte supplements, and a detailed plan for water sources along his route. His medical training made him meticulous about hydration. He knew exactly how much fluid he needed to consume per hour based on temperature, exertion level, and his own body mass. The first 2 days were hot, but manageable. James maintained his hydration schedule precisely, drinking measured amounts at regular intervals, monitoring his urine color to verify adequate hydration. Everything was working according to his physiological understanding. On the 3rd day, while hiking through an exposed section with no tree cover, the temperature exceeded 95 degrees. James increased his water intake appropriately, following his pre-calculated hydration protocol. But despite drinking steadily, he began to feel increasingly thirsty. At first, James attributed this to the extreme heat. Thirst was a natural response, signaling the need for more fluid intake. But he noticed something unusual. His thirst wasn't satisfied by drinking. He would consume a liter of water, feel momentary relief, and then within minutes the thirst would return stronger than before. By afternoon, James had consumed over 6 liters of water, far more than his protocol called for, more than should be physiologically necessary. Yet he was desperately thirsty, his mouth dry, his throat constricted, his entire body screaming for more water. His medical training told him this was impossible. He checked his symptoms against his knowledge of conditions like diabetes insipidus or psychogenic polydipsia. But his urine output was normal. His blood sugar levels were fine based on his glucose monitor, and he didn't have the psychological profile for compulsive water drinking. The thirst was real, intense, overwhelming, but it wasn't being caused by dehydration. James's body had adequate fluid, yet the thirst continued to intensify, becoming the only thing he could think about, dominating his consciousness. He reached a stream and drank directly from it, not bothering with his filter, gulping water frantically. The cool liquid felt wonderful going down, relief flooding through him. But within 30 seconds, the thirst returned, worse than before. James dropped to his knees beside the stream and drank again and again and again, consuming water faster than his stomach could process it. He finally stopped when he began vomiting, his stomach rejecting the massive volume of water he had forced into it. James knelt beside the stream, retching, while the thirst burned in his throat, undiminished by the gallons he had consumed. This was medically impossible. The human thirst mechanism was regulated by hypothalamic osmoreceptors responding to blood osmolality. With the amount of water James had consumed, those receptors should be signaling satiation, not continued thirst. Yet the thirst remained, physiologically inexplicable. James tried to continue hiking, but the thirst made it nearly impossible to focus on anything else. Every step, every breath was accompanied by an overwhelming desire for water. He returned to the stream and drank again, his rational medical mind screaming that this was dangerous, that he was risking water intoxication and hyponatremia, but unable to resist the compulsion. As evening approached, James gave up trying to hike. He set up his tent beside the stream, unable to move more than a few yards from the water source. Throughout the night, he drank repeatedly, his stomach painfully distended, his body bloated with fluid, yet the thirst never diminished. By morning, James could see that something was physically wrong. His body should be severely overhydrated. He should have edema, electrolyte imbalances, possibly even cerebral swelling from water intoxication. But aside from the distended stomach, he showed no signs of fluid overload. His body was processing water impossibly fast, or the water was going somewhere other than his circulatory system and tissues. He forced himself to leave the stream, to hike toward the next town where he could get medical help. The thirst made every step torture. James found himself thinking about water constantly, his mind cataloging every stream, every spring, every moisture source he passed. The thirst had become his entire existence. After 2 miles, James encountered another hiker coming from the opposite direction. The man took one look at James and backed away. "What's wrong with your mouth?" he asked, his voice disturbed. James touched his lips and felt something wrong. Pulling out his small mirror, he looked at his reflection and horror washed over him. His lips were cracked and bleeding, dried out as if he hadn't drunk water in days. His tongue was swollen and dark. His skin looked desiccated, hanging loose on his face. He looked severely dehydrated despite having consumed more than 10 liters of water in the past 24 hours. The water wasn't staying in his body, it was passing through him or evaporating from him or disappearing into some physiological void that his medical training couldn't explain. James was drinking constantly but dehydrating continuously, trapped in a cycle where water provided no hydration, where thirst couldn't be quenched. The other hiker called for emergency services. James was evacuated by ranger vehicle to a hospital in Knoxville. The medical team found his condition baffling. Blood tests showed severe dehydration, kidney function was compromised, his tissues showed signs of critical fluid depletion. Yet James insisted he had been drinking water almost continuously. They put him on IV fluids, running saline into his veins. James felt the fluids entering his body, felt momentary relief, but within minutes the thirst returned. The IV bags emptied impossibly fast, as if his body was a hole that fluid poured into without filling. Over 3 days, the hospital administered over 30 liters of IV fluid. James should have died from fluid overload. His heart should have failed, his lungs should have filled with fluid, his brain should have swollen. But instead, he remained desperately thirsty, desperately dehydrated, his body refusing to retain any fluid whatsoever. Medical specialists consulted. nephrologists, endocrinologists, physiologists. No one could explain the mechanism. James's kidneys were producing almost no urine despite the massive fluid intake. The water was disappearing, going somewhere that medical imaging couldn't detect. On the fourth day, a nurse noticed something disturbing. When James drank water, his shadow changed. It became darker, more substantial, and appeared to drink with him, not a reflection of his movement, but an independent action. The shadow was consuming the water, absorbing the fluid before James's body could process it. James began to observe this himself. His shadow had become separate somehow, had developed its own thirst, and that shadow thirst was infinite. Every drop of water James consumed was being taken by the shadow first, leaving nothing for his actual body. He was feeding a void that existed in his shadow, an emptiness that could never be filled. Medical staff began restricting his water intake, trying to rehydrate him slowly, but James became violent when denied water. The thirst overrode all rational thought, all self-control. He would attack nurses to reach water sources, would drink from toilet bowls, from vases, from anywhere moisture existed. They sedated him and continued IV fluids, but his condition continued deteriorating. James's body was mummifying while simultaneously receiving fluids. He looked like a corpse from dehydration even as saline poured into his veins. His shadow grew darker and larger, spreading across the hospital room walls, visibly drinking from the IV bags, consuming the fluid meant for James's body. After 2 weeks, James signed himself out of the hospital against medical advice. He knew they couldn't help him. Whatever had happened on that trail, whatever thirst had awakened in him, or in his shadow, was beyond medical treatment. He moved to Seattle, choosing the rainiest city in America, somewhere water was constantly present. He lives beside Lake Washington, surrounded by moisture, drinking continuously from morning to night. The thirst never stops. His body is a withered husk, despite constant hydration. His shadow is enormous, dark, and substantial, stretching across his entire apartment, even in dim light, always drinking, always thirsty. James has stopped practicing medicine. He can't focus on anything except the thirst. He has documented his condition, written case studies of himself, tried to understand through medical literature what is happening to him. But medicine has no framework for shadows that drink, for thirst that exists outside the body, for dehydration that can't be relieved no matter how much water is consumed. He warns other hikers in online forums about the Tennessee Trail section where his thirst began, but he can't identify what triggered it. Was it a particular water source? A specific location? Something he touched or ingested? He doesn't know, can only warn that thirst isn't always physical, that need can exist in dimensions medicine doesn't acknowledge, that some hungers live in shadows and consume everything meant for the body that casts them, leaving only emptiness no amount of water can fill. Story 4. The Correct Direction. Linda Park was a 45-year-old orienteering champion from Colorado who had won national competitions in wilderness navigation. She could read topographical maps like most people read books, could orient herself using sun, stars, landmarks, and dead reckoning. Her sense of direction was legendary among competitive navigators. She had once found her way out of backcountry Montana after being lost for 3 days using only her innate directional sense. In May 2018, while section hiking through Pennsylvania, Linda discovered that her perfect sense of direction was actually a compulsion being broadcast from an external source, and that what she thought was instinct was actually obedience to commands she couldn't refuse. Linda was hiking alone, not following a guidebook, but navigating purely by map and compass, treating the AT section as an extended orienteering exercise. She carried detailed topographical maps and took pride in finding the trail through pure navigation rather than simply following blazes. The first 3 days were perfect. Linda's navigation was flawless. She anticipated every turn, knew exactly where she was at all times, and made excellent time. She felt that familiar rightness when her internal compass aligned with the actual cardinal directions. That satisfaction of moving exactly where she intended to go. On the fourth day, something changed. Linda was hiking along a straight section when she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn left, leaving the trail and heading directly into the forest. The compulsion was intense, far stronger than normal directional intuition. It felt like the most correct thing in the world to turn left at that exact moment. Linda resisted staying on the trail, but the feeling persisted. Every fiber of her being insisted that left was the correct direction, that continuing straight was wrong somehow, that she needed to turn left immediately. It wasn't a thought or a decision. It was a deep, physical certainty that left was right and straight was wrong. After 10 minutes of fighting the compulsion, Linda stopped walking. She pulled out her compass and map, verifying her position. According to both, she should continue straight on the trail. Turning left would take her off the AT, into dense forest with no destination or landmark in that direction. It made no navigational sense, yet the compulsion remained, growing stronger. Linda felt physical discomfort continuing straight. A wrongness in her body, as if she were walking backward or upside down. Her navigational sense, usually so reliable, was screaming that left was correct and the trail itself was wrong. She tried to override it, hiked another mile straight ahead, but the discomfort intensified to pain. Her head throbbed, her balance felt off, she became nauseous. Every step straight was agony. But when she took even one step to the left, the discomfort immediately eased. Linda finally gave in. She turned left, stepping off the trail into the forest, and relief flooded through her. The compulsion quieted, replaced by that familiar rightness she associated with correct navigation. She was going the correct direction now. Her entire being confirmed it. But Linda's rational mind knew this was wrong. She was bushwhacking through forest with no trail, no destination, guided only by this overwhelming sense that left was correct. She tried to stop, tried to turn around, but the compulsion wouldn't allow it. Continuing in the direction she was moving felt right. Any other direction felt impossibly wrong. She walked for 2 hours through dense forest, struggling over rocks and through underbrush, following this inner directive that insisted she was going exactly where she needed to go. Then the direction changed. Now she needed to go northeast. The compulsion shifted and Linda found herself turning, following the new correct direction. Over the next several days, Linda was guided through the wilderness by this external directional sense. It would point her in a specific direction. She would follow until it shifted, then she would follow the new direction. She had no idea where she was going or why. She was simply being moved through the landscape like a game piece, following commands that came from some source outside herself but felt like they originated in her deepest navigational instincts. She tried to rebel, tried to go in directions the compulsion indicated were wrong. But the physical discomfort was unbearable. Her body enforced the commands through pain and nausea. Linda realized she wasn't navigating. She had never been navigating. What she had thought was her innate sense of direction was actually receptivity to external signals, and something was now transmitting those signals with intensity she couldn't resist. The compulsion led her to places no hiker would normally go. Steep ravines, dense laurel thickets, rocky outcrops that required dangerous climbing. But each destination felt correct when she arrived, as if these were waypoints on some route only she could follow, a path that existed in directional space but not physical space. On what might have been the 8th or 10th day, Linda had lost track of time, focused only on following the correct directions. She arrived at a clearing deep in the forest, miles from any trail. In the center of the clearing was a rock formation, natural but arranged in a way that suggested intentionality. like a compass rose carved by geology rather than human hands. Linda approached the formation and felt something shift. The compulsion that had been driving her suddenly multiplied, fragmenting into dozens of simultaneous directions. Her navigational sense was being pulled in every direction at once: north, south, east, west, and angles between, all simultaneously correct, all demanding she go that way immediately. She collapsed in the clearing, overwhelmed by the contradictory compulsions. Her head felt like it would split apart, her inner ear spun, her sense of balance and direction completely destroyed by receiving too many simultaneous commands. Then, as suddenly as it had fragmented, the directional sense unified again. But now it pointed in a direction that had no name, that didn't correspond to any cardinal point. It pointed up and down simultaneously, inward and outward, a direction that couldn't exist in normal three-dimensional space but felt more real than any conventional direction Linda had ever followed. She stood and tried to follow this impossible direction, and found that she could. By walking in a specific pattern around the rock formation, by moving through space in a way that shouldn't work, Linda was able to go in the direction the compulsion indicated. She was navigating through a dimension that normal humans didn't perceive, following a path that existed perpendicular to conventional geography. Linda walked this impossible direction for what felt like hours or minutes. Time had become as uncertain as direction. Then she found herself on a road, miles from where she had entered the forest, with no memory of the transit between. The compulsion was gone. Her sense of direction returned to normal, pointing conventionally north, south, east, and west. She hitched a ride to the nearest town and tried to reconstruct what had happened. Her GPS track showed an impossible route. She had covered terrain that should have taken weeks in just days, had traversed sections with no passable geography, had somehow moved through space in ways that violated normal topology. Linda never competed in orienteering again. She couldn't trust her navigational sense anymore, knowing it was receptive to external signals, knowing that something could broadcast commands that felt like instinct but were actually manipulation. She had discovered that what she thought was talent was actually sensitivity, that her perfect sense of direction made her a perfect receiver for whatever transmitted those directional imperatives. She works now in an urban environment, surrounded by grid streets and GPS navigation, never trusting her own sense of direction, always verifying with external tools. But sometimes, especially near wilderness areas, Linda feels it, a compulsion toward a specific direction, a certainty that she needs to go exactly that way. A command broadcast from some source she never identified, calling her back to continue navigating the impossible routes, to follow the correct directions through dimensions that normal maps don't chart. To complete whatever journey she was being guided toward in that Pennsylvania forest. A journey she interrupted but never finished, leaving some destination unreached, some route incomplete, waiting for her to return and follow the correct direction to whatever endpoint exists in the spaces between the conventional cardinal points. Story 5. The Clean Hiker. Richard Torres was a 33-year-old germaphobe and microbiologist from Phoenix who understood contamination at a molecular level. He knew bacteria, viruses, fungi, understood how pathogens spread and how to avoid them. His obsessive cleanliness was grounded in scientific knowledge rather than irrational fear. In September 2015, while attempting his first backpacking trip on the AT through Georgia, Richard discovered that wilderness has its own standards of cleanliness, and that trying to remain sterile in an environment designed for decay can mark you as foreign, as other, as something that needs to be corrected by forces that value decomposition over preservation. Richard had prepared extensively for his 5-day hike. He carried antimicrobial wipes, hand sanitizer, water purification tablets, and a comprehensive first aid kit with antibiotics. He understood he couldn't maintain laboratory standards in the wilderness, but he planned to minimize his exposure to pathogens through careful hygiene protocols. The first 2 days were manageable. Richard used his wipes frequently, sanitized before eating, and treated all water sources with both filtration and chemical purification. Other hikers found his precautions excessive, but Richard felt comfortable maintaining his cleanliness standards. On the 3rd day, Richard noticed something unusual. The dirt on his boots and clothes seemed to be actively avoiding him. When he sat down at a shelter, the wood beneath him appeared cleaner when he stood up, as if his presence had sterilized it. Other hikers mentioned that he didn't smell like someone who had been hiking for 3 days. No sweat odor, no accumulated body dirt, nothing. Richard checked his skin and clothing. Despite 2 days of hiking, he was remarkably clean. Too clean. His clothes showed no stains, his skin had no dirt under the nails, even his boots looked barely used. The wilderness grime that accumulated on every hiker seemed unable to stick to him. At first, Richard was pleased. His hygiene protocols were working better than expected. But as the day progressed, he began to feel observed. The forest seemed to be watching him, paying attention to the clean human moving through its dirty systems. That evening, at a shelter with 4 other hikers, Richard noticed everyone was subtly moving away from him. He asked if something was wrong, and one hiker, a through hiker named Jake, finally said, "You're too clean, man. It's not natural. You've been hiking for 3 days and you look like you just stepped out of a shower. It's freaking people out." Richard tried to explain his hygiene protocols, but the other hikers remained uncomfortable. That night, they all chose to tent outside rather than share the shelter with him. Richard found himself alone in the structure, the only human in a space designed for community. As darkness fell, Richard noticed the first spot of mold. It appeared on his backpack, a small patch of fuzzy growth that definitely hadn't been there an hour before. He wiped it away with an antimicrobial cloth, but within minutes it had returned larger. More mold appeared on his sleeping bag, his food bag, even his clothes while he was wearing them. The growth was impossibly fast, occurring at rates that would take weeks in normal conditions, but happening in minutes. Richard wiped and sanitized frantically, but the mold kept returning, growing faster each time he removed it. He realized what was happening. By maintaining such extreme cleanliness, by refusing to accumulate the normal dirt and microorganisms that covered everything in the wilderness, Richard had marked himself as sterile, as empty, as an available surface. The forest was trying to colonize him, to establish the microbial coverage that everything else in this environment possessed. The mold began spreading from his gear to his body. Richard felt it growing on his skin. Fuzzy patches on his arms, his neck, his face. He scrubbed desperately with his sanitizing wipes, but the chemicals only seemed to make the growth accelerate. The mold wanted him, wanted to cover the sterile surface he represented. Richard abandoned the shelter and hiked through the night, trying to reach a road, but the mold continued spreading. By dawn, he was covered in fungal growth, his clothes and skin hidden beneath layers of rapidly expanding mold and lichen. He looked like a forest creature, like something that had been part of the wilderness for years rather than days. The fungal coverage wasn't killing him, but it was changing him. Richard could feel the mycelial network spreading beneath his skin, connecting to the forest's larger microbial systems. He was being integrated, made part of the wilderness ecosystem, converted from sterile human to colonized surface. He reached a road and flagged down a car. The driver was horrified by his appearance. Richard looked like a mold-covered corpse, more fungus than human. They called for emergency services immediately. At the hospital, doctors tried to remove the fungal growth, but it had integrated too deeply. Antifungal medications had no effect. The fungus had somehow merged with Richard's tissues, becoming part of him rather than simply growing on him. Medical mycologists consulted, finding species they couldn't identify. fungal structures that didn't match any known taxonomy. Over the following weeks, the visible mold was gradually removed through careful debridement, but Richard knew it never truly left. He could feel the mycelial networks beneath his skin, dormant but present, waiting. If he cleaned himself too thoroughly, if he tried to return to his former standards of sterility, the growth would activate again, spreading to reclaim the surface he tried to keep empty. Richard stopped working as a microbiologist. He couldn't maintain the sterile technique his work required, couldn't trust himself in laboratory environments where contamination was catastrophic. The wilderness had marked him, had colonized him, and he carried that colonization permanently. He lives now with minimal hygiene, showering infrequently, never using antimicrobial products, allowing normal dirt and oils to accumulate on his skin. This layer of ordinary filth protects him from the aggressive colonization, satisfying the wilderness's demand that he be covered, that he be part of the ecosystem rather than separate from it. Richard has researched historical cases, finding scattered accounts of two clean people who went into wilderness and were aggressively colonized by environmental microorganisms. In every case, the victims had maintained extreme cleanliness, had refused to accept the normal layer of wilderness grime, and had been forcibly integrated into the ecosystem through rapid fungal or bacterial growth. He warns other germaphobes about wilderness hiking, explaining that there are environments where cleanliness is not next to godliness but is instead a marker for colonization, where sterility is seen as emptiness that must be filled, where refusing to get dirty marks you as foreign and triggers aggressive responses from ecosystems that value decay and decomposition, that recognize sterile surfaces as unnatural, and work to correct them through rapid establishment of microbial coverage. Sometimes Richard looks at his skin under magnification and sees the mycelial network still there, dormant threads of fungus waiting beneath the surface. He knows that if he ever returns to wilderness, if he ever attempts to stay too clean in an environment designed for dirt, the colonization will resume, the mold will spread, and the forest will finish what it started, converting the sterile human into a surface suitable for growth, a substrate for decay, a part of the ecosystem rather than a visitor passing through it, leaving him changed from microbiologist who studied contamination to contaminated surface that studies the impossibility of remaining clean in environments that demand you carry their dirt as a mark of belonging. Story 6. The Authentic Trail. Vincent Marsh was a 37-year-old influencer and outdoor photographer from Los Angeles who specialized in authentic wilderness experiences. He had 250,000 followers across social platforms, all drawn to his carefully curated images of pristine trail moments, his inspirational captions about finding yourself in nature, his perfectly filtered photographs that made the wilderness look accessible and beautiful. In April 2021, while planning a photo series on the AT through Virginia, Vincent discovered that authenticity is a dangerous thing to seek, and that the wilderness will give you exactly what you claim to want, stripping away every artificial layer until only raw truth remains, whether you're ready for it or not. Vincent arrived at the trail with professional camera equipment, several changes of photogenic hiking outfits, and a detailed shot list designed to generate maximum engagement. He planned a 4-day hike but expected to spend most of his time staging photographs rather than actual hiking. His assistant Maria accompanied him to help with equipment and lighting. The first day was frustrating. Every photo Vincent staged looked wrong. The lighting was harsh. The backgrounds were cluttered. His poses looked forced. Nothing captured the authentic wilderness experience his brand promised. His followers expected beauty, inspiration, transcendence. But reality kept intruding with unflattering angles, sweat stains, and genuine exhaustion. That evening at the shelter, Vincent complained to Maria about the difficulty of getting authentic-looking shots. An older thru hiker, overhearing this, laughed. Authentic looking? You mean you want fake photos that look real? The real authentic experience isn't very photogenic, son. Vincent was annoyed by this comment. His entire platform was built on authentic wilderness experience. He wasn't faking anything. He was just presenting the truth in its most appealing form. The next morning, he woke early to catch sunrise photos, determined to capture something genuinely authentic. As he hiked to a scenic overlook, Vincent felt something shift. The trail began to look different, less maintained, more genuinely wild. The blazes faded. The cleared path became overgrown. The signs of human passage disappeared. This was more like it, Vincent thought. This was the real wilderness, the authentic experience his followers craved. He began photographing, and for the first time, the images looked right. The wilderness was presenting itself perfectly. Dramatic light, pristine landscapes, no evidence of other hikers or human impact. Vincent shot hundreds of photos, thrilled with the authentic material he was capturing. But as the morning progressed, the wilderness became more authentic. Not just less maintained, but actively hostile. Plants that Vincent brushed against left genuine scratches, not the decorative-looking scrapes that looked good in photos, but authentic, deep cuts. Rocks he climbed over were genuinely unstable, not picturesque challenges, but actual dangers. The stream he crossed was genuinely cold and fast, nearly sweeping him away rather than providing a charming photo opportunity. Vincent realized the wilderness was giving him exactly what he claimed to want. Absolute authenticity without any of the safety margins or human management that made wilderness accessible. He was experiencing nature as it existed before trails were maintained, before shelters were built, before the AT made wilderness navigation possible for recreational hikers. He tried to return to the maintained trail, but it was gone. The blazes had vanished completely. The cleared path had disappeared into forest. The signs and markers were absent. Vincent and Maria were in genuine wilderness now, without trails or guidance, experiencing authentic nature in all its indifferent danger. Vincent's photography equipment began to fail. His camera batteries died impossibly fast. His lenses fogged from the inside, his filters cracked. The wilderness refused to be captured, refused to pose for his authentic documentation. Maria's phone navigation wouldn't work, the GPS showing their position, but no trails, no roads, no human structures within the displayed range. They tried to bushwhack toward where the trail should be, but the terrain actively resisted them. Every direction led to obstacles, cliffs that couldn't be climbed, streams that couldn't be forded, vegetation so dense it was impenetrable. The authentic wilderness had no interest in being traversable, had no obligation to provide paths or passages. By evening, they were lost, exhausted, and increasingly frightened. Vincent tried to start a fire using the techniques he had often photographed himself demonstrating, but authentic fire starting was harder than the edited versions he posted online. His hands were blistered from genuine friction, not the artful dirt that looked good in close-ups. His clothes were torn from authentic bushwhacking, not the designer-distressed hiking wear he usually posed in. That night, without shelter or fire, Vincent experienced authentic cold, authentic hunger, authentic fear. There were no filters to make it look beautiful, no captions to frame it as spiritual growth, no editing to remove the unglamorous reality of being genuinely lost in genuine wilderness. Maria was crying, terrified they would die out here. Vincent tried to comfort her, but his inspirational platitudes about finding yourself in nature rang hollow when faced with the authentic possibility of not finding your way out. The wilderness didn't care about his follower count, his engagement metrics, his carefully cultivated brand of accessible adventure. On the second day lost, Vincent's appearance began to change. Not the photogenic changes of a long-distance hiker, Not the lean fitness and distinguished weathering he often tried to capture in his transformation posts, but authentic deterioration. His skin blistered from sun exposure, his lips cracked and bled, his eyes became red and swollen from plant allergens. He looked genuinely damaged, not artfully weathered. More disturbing, his features began to simplify. The fine details of his face, the specific shape of his nose, the individual character lines that made him recognizable, were fading, becoming generic. Vincent was losing the distinguishing characteristics that made him photogenic, becoming just another anonymous human struggling in wilderness. Maria noticed it too. "Your face, it looks different, like a stock photo of a person rather than you specifically." Vincent pulled out his phone, using the camera in selfie mode to check his reflection. Maria was right. He looked like a placeholder, like a generic human template rather than Vincent Marsh specifically. The wilderness was stripping away his specific identity, reducing him to archetypal human, removing the individual features that his brand was built on. By the third day, Vincent had become completely generic. He looked like he could be any male hiker, no distinguishing features, no memorable characteristics. Maria could barely remember what he had looked like before. Trying to recall his specific face produced only vague impressions. The wilderness was giving him authentic humanity, the basic form without the specific details that made individuals recognizable. Vincent had built his career on being distinctive, being memorable, being someone his followers could identify and connect with. Now he was being reduced to the authentic baseline, the fundamental human without enhancement or distinction. On what might have been the fourth or fifth day, Vincent's sense of time had become as generic as his appearance. They encountered a ranger. The ranger looked shocked to see them, saying he'd been searching for days. But when Maria tried to explain who Vincent was, tried to tell the ranger about his social media presence and the thousands of people who must be worried, the ranger had no idea what she was talking about. "You mean you're with someone?" the ranger asked. "I only see you." Maria insisted Vincent was right there, but the ranger couldn't see him. Vincent had become so authentic, so reduced to baseline humanity that he was now indistinguishable from the wilderness itself. Present but unperceivable, existing but unrecognizable. Maria was rescued and returned to civilization. She tried to explain what had happened to Vincent, but without any photos or videos to document his presence on the trip, without any specific identifying details she could remember about his appearance, authorities could find no evidence he had ever been there. His social media accounts became memorial pages, his followers mourning his disappearance in the wilderness. But Vincent is still there, hiking the authentic wilderness that exists beneath or beside the maintained AT. He has become completely generic, perfectly authentic, human in the most basic sense, but lacking any specific identity. Other hikers occasionally report encountering someone on the trail they can't quite describe. Someone who seems familiar in the way all humans are familiar but impossible to remember or identify specifically. Vincent wanted authentic wilderness experience, wanted to strip away the artificiality of modern trails and social media presentations. The wilderness gave him exactly that, removing not just the artificial enhancements but the specific details that made him Vincent Marsh, reducing him to authentic baseline humanity, indistinguishable and unmemorable, hiking forever in the spaces where authenticity means the loss of everything that made him individually real. Everything that his carefully curated brand tried to preserve through filters and captions and perfectly staged photographs that claimed to show truth while carefully hiding it, until truth finally claimed him completely, leaving only the most authentic version of human, generic, universal, and completely forgotten. Story 7. The Courtesy Hiker. Angela Morrison was a 48-year-old etiquette consultant from Charleston who had built her career teaching proper social behavior in various contexts. She understood protocols, understood the rules that governed polite society, understood the importance of courtesy and respect in all interactions. In June 2020, while section hiking through North Carolina, Angela discovered that the wilderness has its own etiquette rules, and that demonstrating proper courtesy to things that shouldn't require courtesy can establish obligations that polite society never prepared her to fulfill. Angela approached hiking with the same attention to propriety she applied to everything. She researched trail etiquette extensively, yielding to uphill hikers, practicing leave-no-trace principles, being respectful of other hikers' experience. She was determined to be a model of courteous behavior on the trail. The first 3 days went smoothly. Angela demonstrated impeccable trail manners, greeting every hiker politely, yielding appropriately, maintaining proper distance at shelters. Other hikers commented on her courtesy, noting how refreshing it was to encounter someone so respectful of trail customs. On the 4th day, while passing a large boulder beside the trail, Angela felt compelled to say, "Excuse me," as she walked past it. The compulsion was automatic, the same polite instinct that made her excuse herself when passing people in tight spaces. She actually spoke the words aloud before realizing the absurdity. She had just apologized to a rock. Angela laughed at herself and continued hiking. But 100 yards later, she felt uncomfortable, as if she had committed a social breach. The proper thing to do, her etiquette instincts insisted, was to go back and properly acknowledge the boulder she had passed. This was clearly irrational, but Angela's entire career was built on following social rules even when they seemed arbitrary. She turned around and walked back to the boulder. Standing before it, feeling ridiculous, she said clearly, "Good morning. I apologize for disturbing your space. Thank you for allowing me to pass." The moment she completed this formal acknowledgement, Angela felt relief. Her discomfort vanished, replaced by the satisfaction of having observed proper courtesy. She continued hiking, but now she found herself greeting other features along the trail, trees, rocks, streams, offering polite acknowledgement as she passed them. At first, Angela tried to resist this compulsion, recognizing it as irrational. But ignoring the urge to offer courtesy produced intense discomfort, while following through with polite greetings brought relief. Her etiquette training had apparently extended beyond human interaction, creating protocols for engaging with inanimate features of the wilderness. By evening, Angela was exhausting herself with courtesy. She had to formally greet every significant tree, apologize to every rock she stepped on, thank every stream she drank from. The social protocols were consuming her hiking time, turning what should be a simple walk into an elaborate series of ritualized interactions. That night at the shelter, Angela tried to explain her situation to other hikers. "I can't seem to stop being polite to everything," she said. "I keep greeting trees and apologizing to rocks. It sounds insane, but I feel genuinely compelled to observe proper etiquette with the entire forest." One of the through hikers, an older woman named Beth, looked concerned. "You're establishing relationships," she said quietly. "In some old traditions, there are rules about acknowledging the spirits in everything. If you start showing them courtesy, they expect it to continue. You've basically entered into social contracts with the forest." Angela wanted to dismiss this as superstition, but her own experience confirmed it. She had established courtesy protocols with the wilderness, and now those protocols demanded to be followed. Every tree, every rock, every feature of the landscape expected formal acknowledgement because she had offered it initially. The social obligations multiplied. Angela found that once she greeted something, she was expected to greet it again if she passed it a second time. She became responsible for maintaining these relationships, for observing proper etiquette in all subsequent interactions. The forest was treating her courtesy as genuine social engagement and expecting her to uphold the standards she had established. By the 6th day, Angela could barely hike. She spent hours fulfilling her etiquette obligations, greeting trees she had acknowledged the previous day, apologizing to rocks she had stepped on before, thanking streams in the formal manner she had established. The wilderness had become a massive social network, and she was trapped in constant interaction, maintaining relationships she had inadvertently created. More disturbing, the wilderness began initiating contact. Trees would creak as she passed, demanding acknowledgement. Rocks would shift under her feet, expecting apology. Streams would change their flow sounds, reminding her to offer thanks. The forest had learned that Angela was responsive to social obligation, and it was actively engaging her, creating situations that required courtesy. Angela tried to leave the trail, to escape these obligations by exiting the wilderness entirely. But her etiquette training wouldn't allow her to leave without properly concluding her relationships. She had to return to every significant feature she had greeted, offer formal farewells, close the social contracts she had established. This would take days, possibly weeks, visiting every tree and rock she had acknowledged. She attempted to do this, hiking back along her route, offering elaborate goodbyes to the features she had greeted. But the wilderness didn't want to let her go. Each farewell was rejected. Trees would creak in ways that sounded like objection. Rocks would make her stumble as if trying to keep her attention. Streams would splash loudly as if protesting her departure. Angela realized she had made a critical error in etiquette. You cannot unilaterally end relationships with entities that consider you socially engaged. The forest, having accepted her courtesy and reciprocated through acknowledgement, considered them to be an ongoing relationship. Leaving without mutual agreement was the ultimate breach of etiquette. She tried to negotiate, standing in the forest and formally requesting release from her obligations. "I have demonstrated proper courtesy and respect," she said to the trees around her. "I now request mutual agreement to conclude our relationship. May we part with mutual good wishes and no further obligations." The forest was silent. Then wind moved through the trees in a pattern that sounded almost like laughter. Angela understood then that she had established protocols but had no authority to modify or end them. The wilderness accepted courtesy but offered no release from the social contracts it created. Angela lives on the trail now, has been there for over 2 years. She maintains her etiquette obligations continuously, greeting and thanking and apologizing to the forest features she has established relationships with. Other hikers occasionally encounter her, report seeing a woman engaged in elaborate one-sided conversations with trees and rocks, performing ritualized movements that look like some kind of ceremony but are actually just the fulfillment of social obligations that have become impossibly complex. She has tried to warn other hikers about the dangers of courtesy. "Don't greet the trees," she tells them. "Don't apologize to the rocks. Don't thank the streams. Courtesy creates obligation, and the wilderness will hold you to every social contract you establish." Most hikers dismiss her warnings, assume she's experienced some kind of mental break. But a few have reported similar compulsions, finding themselves unable to pass certain features without acknowledgement, feeling genuine discomfort when failing to observe proper etiquette with inanimate objects, gradually establishing social protocols with the wilderness that trap them in endless cycles of courtesy. Angela's family has tried to extract her from the trail, but she cannot leave without properly concluding her obligations, and the forest refuses to grant that conclusion. She is trapped not by physical barriers, but by her own adherence to etiquette rules, by her inability to breach protocols she established, by social contracts she entered into without understanding their terms or permanence. She continues her elaborate courtesies, spending her days in formal interaction with trees, rocks, streams, and other features that have come to expect her polite acknowledgement, trapped in relationships that proper etiquette won't allow her to abandon, serving as a cautionary example of how courtesy can become compulsion, how politeness can create obligation, and how demonstrating respect to things that shouldn't require it can establish social contracts that have no release clause, leaving her forever bound by her own good manners, eternally courteous to a wilderness that accepts her etiquette but offers no reciprocal right to conclude the relationship and walk away. Story 8. The Mile Counter. Kenneth Price was a 31-year-old data analyst from Seattle who approached everything in life through quantification. He tracked his steps, his calories, his sleep cycles, his productivity metrics. Numbers defined his reality, and optimization was his constant goal. In March 2014, while attempting a through hike of the AT, Kenneth carried a GPS watch that tracked every mile with precision, documenting his progress numerically. What Kenneth discovered was that counting miles can create debt, and that in the mathematics of the trail, negative numbers represent not deficits, but destinations, places you must reach by subtracting distance from reality itself. Kenneth started his through hike at Springer Mountain with comprehensive tracking systems, his GPS watch, his phone app, his manual log, all documenting miles, elevation, pace, time. He planned to complete the AT in exactly 153 days, covering 14.3 miles per day on average, with rest days calculated precisely. His spreadsheet had every mile planned, every 0-day scheduled, every resupply point timed perfectly. The first 3 weeks went according to plan. Kenneth's tracking was accurate, his mileage consistent with his projections, his progress following the optimized schedule he had created. He was proud of his data, of the precise documentation of his through-hike attempt. Then on day 22, Kenneth's GPS watch showed something impossible. His total mileage was listed as 313.7 miles, but when he checked his position, he was at mile marker 315.9. He had hiked 2.2 more miles than his watch had tracked. Kenneth assumed a GPS error, recalibrated his watch, and continued, but the discrepancy persisted and grew. Each day, his watch tracked fewer miles than he actually covered. By day 25, the difference was over 10 miles. By day 30, it was 50 miles. Kenneth's phone GPS showed the same discrepancy. According to his devices, he should still be in Georgia. But the trail markers clearly showed he was well into North Carolina. He had covered miles that his tracking systems refused to count. He tried to understand the error technically, analyzing GPS signals, checking for device malfunctions. Everything tested normally. The tracking systems were working correctly, they just weren't counting all his miles. Some distance he covered was being subtracted from his total, as if certain sections of trail didn't count toward progress. By day 40, Kenneth's GPS showed him at mile 387, but he was actually at mile 512, according to trail markers. He had covered 125 miles that weren't being counted, that existed physically but not numerically. He was accumulating uncounted distance, miles that failed to register in any of his tracking systems. Then the counter turned negative. On day 43, Kenneth's GPS watch showed 14.2 miles. Negative miles, an impossible metric. You couldn't hike negative distance. But there it was, displayed on his watch, his phone, every tracking system showing negative progress despite him being hundreds of miles north of his starting point. The negative number kept growing. By day 50, his watch showed 187.3 miles. The uncounted miles had become negative miles, as if distance was being subtracted from reality itself. Kenneth was hiking forward but accumulating negative mileage, going deeper into numerical debt with every step. Other hikers' GPS devices worked normally. Only Kenneth's tracking showed the negative miles. Something was specifically affecting his quantification, his attempt to precisely measure and document his progress. The trail was rejecting his counting, his optimization, his numerical reduction of the hiking experience. Kenneth became obsessed with understanding the negative miles. What did they represent? Where was he in relation to the trail when his counter showed negative numbers? If he was at physical mile 600 but numerical mile 200, where was he actually located? He tested this experimentally, watching his GPS reading as he hiked. The negative miles accumulated faster in certain sections, places where the trail was particularly beautiful or difficult, where the experience felt more intense or meaningful. In these sections, Kenneth's watch would subtract multiple miles for each physical mile covered. He was accumulating negative distance in direct proportion to the experiential quality of the hiking. Kenneth realized what was happening. His obsessive tracking had created a debt. By reducing the trail to numbers, by optimizing every mile, by treating the hike as a data problem to be solved rather than an experience to be lived, he had created a deficit in some non-physical accounting system. The trail was charging him, subtracting from his numerical total every time he focused on metrics rather than experience. The negative miles continued accumulating. By day 70, Kenneth's watch showed 431.8 miles. By day 90, 672.3 miles. He was hiking forward physically but moving backward numerically, going deeper into debt with every mile. Then Kenneth noticed other effects. His watch didn't just show negative miles, it was guiding him toward them. When he tried to hike north, his watch would indicate he was moving toward even more negative numbers, but certain directions, certain paths that weren't the official AT, would show the negative number decreasing, moving back toward zero. The watch was directing him, using his debt of negative miles to pull him off the trail, guiding him toward some destination that would balance the numerical account. Kenneth resisted at first, staying on the official AT, but the negative miles kept accumulating and the pull kept strengthening. At 800 miles, Kenneth gave in. He followed the direction that his watch indicated would reduce the negative number. This took him off the AT, bushwhacking into wilderness, following a route that existed numerically but not physically, navigating by the mathematics of debt rather than by trails or maps. As Kenneth hiked this numerically defined route, his negative mileage decreased. 800 became 750, became 700. He was paying off the debt by going where the numbers directed, covering distance that counted against his deficit rather than toward any physical destination. The route took Kenneth through impossible terrain, areas where GPS coordinates didn't make sense, where elevation changed in ways that violated topography, where distance itself seemed flexible. He was hiking through mathematical space rather than physical space, following a path defined by numerical relationships rather than geographical features. At mile 400, Kenneth encountered others, hikers who looked wrong, translucent like projections or memories rather than physical people. They were other counters, other hikers who had obsessively tracked their progress and accumulated negative miles, now trapped paying off their debts through endless hiking in numerical space. They walked together through this impossible landscape, following routes that balanced equations rather than reached destinations. Kenneth tried to communicate with them, but they were locked in their own tracking systems, watching their own GPS displays, following their own debt reduction paths. Kenneth's negative miles slowly decreased. 300, 200, 100. But the return to zero took months of hiking through this mathematical wilderness, covering distance that existed only in the accounting system that had enslaved him. When his counter finally reached zero, Kenneth found himself back on the AT somewhere in Maine, with no memory of how much time had passed. His watch now showed normal positive miles again. He hiked the remaining distance to Katahdin without tracking anything, without checking GPS, without counting or documenting or optimizing. Kenneth never returned to data analysis. He couldn't. Numbers had become dangerous to him. Quantification had revealed itself as a form of debt creation. He works now in manual labor, jobs that can't be reduced to metrics, that resist optimization and tracking. But sometimes Kenneth looks at his old GPS watch, which he kept as a reminder. The display shows 0.0 miles. But occasionally, when he's not watching closely, he sees it flicker to negative numbers for just a moment. A reminder that the debt was paid but not forgiven, that the trail remembers his attempt to reduce it to data, and that somewhere in the mathematics of distance and experience, his account remains open, accumulating interest, waiting for him to start counting again so it can charge him for the presumption of believing that miles are just numbers, that progress can be measured in GPS coordinates, that hiking is a quantifiable activity rather than an experience that resists reduction to data, and punishes those who try to optimize it through tracking and counting and measuring and documenting every step in numerical form. Story 9. The Generous Hiker. Samantha Chen was a 42-year-old philanthropist from San Francisco who had built her life around giving. She donated to charities, volunteered extensively, and approached every situation looking for ways to help others. Her generosity was genuine, driven by a sincere desire to improve the world through personal giving. In November 2019, while section hiking through Tennessee, Samantha discovered that generosity can create vacuum, and that giving indiscriminately opens channels through which things can take far more than you ever offered to give. Samantha approached her hike with the same generous spirit she brought to everything. She carried extra food to share with other hikers, extra supplies for anyone who needed them, a genuine desire to make other people's trail experiences better through her giving. The first 4 days, Samantha gave freely. She shared snacks with hikers who looked hungry, offered her water filter to someone whose had broken, gave her spare batteries to a hiker whose headlamp had died. Each act of generosity brought her satisfaction, confirming her identity as someone who helped others. On the 5th day, while taking a break at a shelter, Samantha encountered a hiker who looked exhausted. Without being asked, Samantha offered food, water, first aid supplies, anything the hiker might need. The hiker accepted everything with gratitude, then looked at Samantha intently and said, "You give freely. That's admirable. But do you know how to stop giving?" Before Samantha could respond, the hiker had departed, leaving her confused by the question. Of course she knew how to stop giving. She gave when people needed help, stopped when the need was met. This seemed obvious. But that evening, Samantha noticed something disturbing. Her food bag was lighter than it should be. She had given away perhaps a pound of food, but her bag felt 10 pounds lighter. She weighed it. The scale confirmed the subjective feeling. She had lost significantly more weight than she had given away. Samantha checked her supplies meticulously. Many items were simply missing, things she definitely hadn't given to anyone, supplies she had carefully packed and hadn't touched. They had vanished from her pack, taken by something she hadn't consciously given to. The next day, the disappearances continued. Samantha would notice items missing from her pack, gear she hadn't offered to anyone. Her tent stakes disappeared. Her spare clothing vanished. Her first aid kit was depleted, though she hadn't used it. Something was taking from her, using her established pattern of giving as an open channel. Samantha tried to stop giving, to close whatever door her generosity had opened. But when she passed hikers who looked like they needed help, she found herself unable to withhold assistance. Her hand would reach into her pack automatically, pulling out items to give, driven by compulsion rather than choice. The generosity had become involuntary, operating beyond her conscious control. Worse, the things taken from her weren't limiting themselves to physical items. Samantha noticed she was losing memories. Small ones at first. What she had for breakfast became unclear. Which trail shelter she had stayed at 2 nights ago was forgotten. But the memory loss accelerated. By day 8, she had lost several days of her past, Important memories from her childhood had vanished. Significant life events were becoming fuzzy. Something was taking her memories as payment for her physical giving. Generosity had opened a channel, and now things could take anything they wanted. Possessions, memories, even pieces of her identity. Samantha tried to close her pack, to stop carrying anything that could be taken, but the taking continued through other means. Her energy was drained. She would wake exhausted despite adequate sleep, as if something had taken her rest. Her body heat was stolen. She would become dangerously cold even in moderate weather, as if something had taken her warmth. Her very life force was being siphoned through the channel her generosity had created. She encountered the mysterious hiker again on day 11. "I warned you," the hiker said. "Generosity without boundaries creates vacuum. You gave freely, so now things can take freely. You opened yourself, so now things can enter and extract whatever they want. Did you think giving was simple? That it was just one direction?" Samantha begged for help, for instructions on how to close the channel. The hiker considered, then said, "The only way to close it is to become completely selfish, to refuse all giving, to close yourself entirely. But for someone like you, someone whose identity is built on generosity, that would mean losing yourself completely. The cure might be worse than the condition." Over the following days, Samantha felt herself being hollowed out. The taking accelerated. Memories, energy, warmth, pieces of her personality and identity. She was becoming empty, a shell that had given away too much and then had everything else taken as well. Other hikers began to avoid her. She looked wrong somehow, translucent, as if she were fading. When she spoke, her voice sounded distant. When she moved, she left no footprints. She was becoming insubstantial, drained of the qualities that made her physically real and personally distinct. Samantha tried desperately to become selfish, to refuse giving, to close the channel. But every attempt felt like betraying her fundamental nature. Denying help to someone who needed it caused her actual physical pain. Her generous nature had become so intrinsic that fighting it was like fighting her own heartbeat. By day 15, Samantha was barely visible. Other hikers would look right through her, unaware of her presence. She had given away so much and had so much taken that very little of her remained. She was becoming a ghost, a memory of a generous person rather than an actual person. She tried to leave the trail, to escape by returning to civilization where structures and rules might protect her from the endless taking. But she found she couldn't leave. Something held her on the trail, kept her in the wilderness where the taking could continue unimpeded. Samantha was last seen by a section hiker on day 19. The hiker reported seeing a translucent figure beside the trail, moving items from an invisible pack to an outstretched hand, giving to someone or something the hiker couldn't see. The figure looked peaceful, the hiker reported, as if the endless giving had become comfortable, as if Samantha had accepted her role as an eternal source, forever giving to things that would never stop taking. Occasional hikers report encountering a presence on the Tennessee section of the AT. Not visible but felt, something that leaves small gifts on the trail. Food that appears in their packs without explanation. Supplies that manifest when needed. They describe feeling grateful but also uncomfortable, as if accepting these gifts creates some obligation they don't understand. Those who research missing persons reports find Samantha's case troubling. She simply vanished on the trail with no body found, no evidence of accident or foul play. Her family describes her as endlessly generous, someone who gave to everyone, who couldn't say no when people needed help. The trail rangers who know the old stories recognize what happened. Every few years, someone generous enough, open enough, naive enough about the nature of giving will create a channel they can't close. These people become sources, eternal givers, drained of their physical and personal substance until only the giving remains. Transformed from individual humans into abstract functions of generosity, forever distributing what they no longer possess. Giving from emptiness to needs that can never be satisfied. Trapped in a mathematics of generosity where giving creates vacuum and vacuum creates more taking. An endless cycle that consumes the giver completely while leaving behind only the function of giving itself, impersonal and eternal. Story 10. The Perfect Section. Alan Whitmore was a 51-year-old perfectionist and project manager from Boston who had spent his career optimizing systems and eliminating inefficiencies. Every aspect of his life was carefully planned, every decision based on maximizing outcomes. In August 2017, while planning his AT section hike through Vermont, Alan designed what he believed was the perfect route. Optimal mileage, ideal weather window, precisely calculated supply points, every variable controlled and optimized. What Alan discovered was that perfection is a dangerous thing to achieve, and that creating a flawless experience can trap you inside it, repeating the perfect loop forever because any deviation would be suboptimal. Alan spent 6 months planning his 7-day Vermont section hike. He analyzed historical weather data, calculated optimal daily mileage based on his fitness level and the terrain, scheduled his trip to coincide with peak fall foliage but minimal crowds. Every detail was optimized, every potential issue planned for. This would be the perfect hike, the ideal AT experience. The first day went exactly according to plan. Alan's mileage was precise, his pace perfect, the weather ideal. He reached his planned shelter exactly on schedule, with energy to spare but not unnecessarily tired. It was perfectly optimized, exactly what he had designed. Days 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were equally perfect. Every aspect unfolded exactly as Alan had calculated. The weather was ideal. His body performed precisely as predicted. Other hikers were friendly but not intrusive. The trail conditions matched his research. It was the perfect hike, flawless execution of a flawless plan. On day 7, Alan reached his planned endpoint, completing the perfect section hike. He felt satisfied, vindicated in his meticulous planning. He had achieved perfection, had created an experience without flaws or suboptimal elements. Alan drove home, unpacked his gear, and began planning his next hike. But something felt wrong. The memory of the Vermont section was unusually vivid, more present than normal memories. He found himself thinking about it constantly, replaying each perfect day, unable to focus on anything else. Then one morning, 3 weeks after completing the hike, Alan woke up in his tent. Not his bedroom, his tent on the trail in Vermont on the first day of his perfect section hike. He was back at the beginning, repeating day 1 exactly as it had occurred before. At first, Alan thought he was dreaming or experiencing some kind of flashback. But everything was perfectly real, the physical sensations, the weather, the specific details of the first day. He was actually here, actually repeating the perfect hike. Alan tried to deviate from his plan, to do something different that would prove this wasn't the same experience. But he found himself unable to make different choices. His body followed the optimized route automatically. His decisions matched the perfect plan. His actions were locked into the sequence he had designed. He hiked day 1 perfectly, reached the shelter exactly on schedule, experienced everything exactly as he had the first time. Then day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all perfect, all identical to the original experience, all impossible to deviate from. On day 7, Alan reached the endpoint and immediately found himself back at the beginning. Day 1 started again, perfectly identical, and the loop continued. He was trapped in his perfect section hike, repeating it endlessly, unable to introduce any variation or imperfection that might break the cycle. Alan tried desperately to be suboptimal, to make mistakes, to introduce inefficiencies. But the perfection was self-maintaining. His body wouldn't let him walk slower or faster than the optimal pace. His decisions were constrained to the perfect choices. He couldn't deliberately get lost, couldn't choose wrong shelters, couldn't create any deviation from the flawless plan. He was living the same 7 days over and over, trapped in a loop of perfection that his own optimization had created. Each iteration was identical, each detail exactly matching the original. Alan knew every conversation he would have, every view he would see, every sensation he would feel. The perfect hike had become perfect hell. Alan tried to communicate with other hikers in the loop, tried to explain that he was trapped, that he had experienced this exact hike hundreds of times now. But the other hikers were part of the loop. They responded with the same words each iteration, played out their roles in the perfect script, unaware that they were repeating rather than experiencing. Time became meaningless. Alan lost count of how many iterations he had completed. Hundreds? Thousands? The perfect 7 days repeated endlessly, and he was trapped inside them, a consciousness locked in a loop of his own design. Occasionally, Alan would retain awareness through the transitions, would feel himself being reset to day 1, would experience the discontinuity between day 7 and day 1. But most of the time, he would simply find himself back at the beginning, starting the perfect hike again, with only a vague sense that he had done this before. The worst part was that he couldn't make himself stop appreciating the perfection. Each iteration, his planning was vindicated again. The hike was objectively flawless, optimal in every respect. Part of him, the project manager who valued perfection above all else, was satisfied even while the rest of him screamed in despair at the endless repetition. Alan exists now in that loop, has existed in it for over 6 years of external time but countless iterations of internal experience. Occasionally, hikers in Vermont report seeing someone who seems to be repeating the same hike pattern, showing up at the same shelters on the same days regardless of date or season, hiking the same route with identical pace and schedule, living in a temporal loop that only he experiences. Some hikers have tried to interact with him, have noticed that he seems confused, sometimes claims to have been hiking for years despite being in excellent physical condition. But he can never explain coherently, can never break free from the script long enough to communicate the nature of his trap. The rangers who know about Alan's disappearance 7 years ago recognize that something unusual happened. He simply vanished after completing a hike. His car was at the trailhead. His gear returned to his home, but Alan himself never came back. Officially, he's listed as missing, but no evidence of foul play or accident was found. What the rangers don't know is that Alan never left. He's still hiking that perfect section, still trapped in the loop of his own creation, still experiencing the flawless 7 days he designed so carefully. He learned too late that perfection is a trap, that optimization creates rigidity, that eliminating all variables and flaws means eliminating any possibility of change or escape. Somewhere in Vermont, on a section of the AT that looks normal to everyone else, Alan Whitmore continues his perfect hike, day after day, week after week, year after year, trapped in a loop of flawless execution, unable to introduce the imperfection that might free him, unable to deviate from the optimal plan, unable to escape the perfect experience he created, living forever in 7 days that repeat without variation, without growth, without any possibility of ending. The ultimate price of achieving perfection. To be trapped inside it forever, experiencing the same optimal sequence endlessly, unable to progress beyond the perfect because progression would mean imperfection, and imperfection is not allowed in the system he designed. The perfect prison of his own making, optimal and eternal and utterly inescapable.